Say I haven't given this talk since the job market, which this was my job market paper, so we'll see. And also Enrico and I have slightly different emphases in our slides, so it'll be an interesting adventure to see what comes up. But the title of this paper is Novel Ideas, the Effects of Carnegie Libraries on Innovation. I am going to also have my chat up here, sorry, so that I can respond just in case Enrico gets back online. So the motivation for this paper starts with the observation that costs of accessing knowledge are an important part of the innovative process, right? And throughout history, there's been multiple, policies and also just kind of technological advances that have dramatically lowered the costs of accessing knowledge. And in this paper, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of explore the effects of reducing these knowledge access costs. And we're going to exploit new data from one of the largest rollouts of public institutions in history, which is the construction of almost 1,700 public libraries across the United States between 1890 and 1920 by Andrew Carnegie. The kind of motivation for why we think libraries might matter is that we know that libraries were an important source of knowledge. So Carnegie actually called them the people's university. And I think we're going to show, we'll see what slides come up next, that there is actually ample historical evidence that inventors actually did use public libraries as sources of information. So here's an example. Here's an example from a recent biography of Thomas Edison that's showing that he's using a lot of information that was stored in a public library near one of his early laboratories. So to give an overview of the paper, we're going to use a difference in difference approach, comparing towns that actually built Carnegie Libraries to a control group of cities that were granted money for Carnegie, but eventually did not build the library. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this control group later. It's kind of the core identification in the paper. The main result is that we do find that public libraries had an impact on innovation at the local level. Now, by innovation here, I want to be careful. What we really observe is patenting. So what we see is an increase in patenting of about 7 to 12% in the 20 years after the libraries opened. Kind of importantly, this increased patenting is concentrated in the practical trades. So you might not expect that public libraries are going to be able to help you, patent in theoretical physics. But, for example, there's a nice anecdote, I don't even know if it's in the paper anymore, of someone learning about how to make one of the original garage door openers from a public library. So that's kind of the practical trade patenting that we would expect and that we see. And then we'll talk about possible mechanisms. I think the chance of me talking about them too much is low in this paper, but there's basically two big mechanisms that we think about. First, you could think about an increase in access to information, right? Which is what I've talked about before, but information isn't just in books. It can also be in other people, and libraries, even at this time, were kind of a central place for people to gather and collaborate. So we'll also look at some of the collaboration channels. Okay, so here is the outline, as helpful as much for me as it is for you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history, and then we'll get into kind of what we do with the data. Okay, so before Carnegie, the way to think about these public libraries is that Carnegie is giving a bunch of cities that didn't have libraries their first library. And he's also improving the stock of libraries across the United States. So in the 19th century, there were libraries, but many of them were subscription libraries, right? So you had to be a member of a church, or Benjamin Franklin famously had a library in Philadelphia where you had to pay a fee. There were also commercial subscription libraries that mostly held things like novels, so not sort of nonfiction. The public libraries did start spreading at this time. By 1890, there were about 700 libraries nationwide that kind of met our definition of public libraries, mostly in the Northeast. And even when a town had a public library, it was often small and not what we consider today to be a standard public library. So that there were libraries in the basement of a hospital, in the horse stall of a fire department, or here's an example from Bend, Oregon. We actually have a picture of this one. So here's the local newspaper building in Bend. If you look very closely, you might have to look close to your monitors. This sign says public library. So this is like kind of a fairly low quality, not many books. So Carnegie is going to improve both the kind of the extensive margin of library penetration across the United States, and in places like Bend, be able to, replace this small room with a full-fledged library. So Andrew Carnegie enters this picture. Here's a nice picture of him. The idea behind Carnegie's philanthropy is that he wanted to give his money towards organizations that helped people help themselves. So he didn't want to just give cash transfers to the poor. He kind of had this, belief that, if we build institutions like libraries, the self-motivated people will go and learn like he had done as a youth. There's kind of two broad periods of Carnegie's giving. So Carnegie was a very active businessman, all the way up until the early 1900s. So he kind of, started his philanthropy pretty slow. So he gave a few grants where he knew people or where he lived. And then he really kicked off the program starting in this later time period, right? When he gave, over 1,000 grants, well over 1,000 grants, and only 3 states in the United States ended up without a Carnegie Library. Interestingly, because this is an international audience, I should just mention, I'm going to focus on libraries in the United States. Carnegie also gave money to build libraries in Canada and in Scotland and the United Kingdom, where he had spent some time. So to kind of look at the spread of Carnegie Libraries, so here are the retail period libraries. I don't know the story of this main library. The Carnegie's operations were based in Pittsburgh, around Pennsylvania, or in Pennsylvania. So that explains the cluster of libraries there. He actually knew a senator in Iowa, so that explains that library. Oh, and here's the wholesale period. See, I'm still learning how Enrico organizes his slides. So by 1920, you could see this massive expansion in libraries. So libraries are organized across the United States. I think there's a couple interesting geographic features here that I like to point out. One is that if you look at the Midwestern United States, right, so these states here, there's a lot of libraries. In part, that's because many of these places didn't have libraries at all, right? So I mentioned that in the past, right, the Northeast had some libraries already, so you can imagine there wasn't as much room for there to be a significant increase. The other thing that's important here is the South. So, the South has fewer people, so on a per capita basis, this isn't as dramatic as it would be otherwise, but it is still true that there are fewer libraries in the South. So we'll talk a little bit about why that might be as we go forward. The West is sort of, it looks like there's no libraries, but if you overlay a population density, they're getting libraries at about the same rate as the rest of the country. So a little bit about the application process. So Carnegie kind of opened the program to all. So there wasn't a stringent application process that you had to go through. Once Carnegie opened the program to all, he got many requests for libraries, as this cartoon illustrates. And I like to say this cartoon is also, in some sense, where we get a lot of the data for this project. So a lot of the information that we know about Carnegie Libraries comes from these letters that went back and forth to the Carnegie office. That is I think just an interesting feature of this. So either we've actually looked at these letters themselves or other historians have, and we can build on that information. So here's a letter that Carnegie would send back. So this was actually sent by his secretary. It also highlights the main requirements of Carnegie's grants. So cities had to provide the site. Carnegie gave you the full amount of money needed to build a big, beautiful building, but cities actually had to provide the land. That's why in many small United States towns, Carnegie Libraries are pretty close to town hall. You know, in part that might just be because that's the center of town, but also you can imagine maybe cities already had some land. Carnegie also required you to pledge money to continue supporting the library. So kind of like his broader views on philanthropy, Carnegie didn't just want to give you the money, he wanted to make sure that your town was supporting it. So this was a grant for $12,000, right? And Carnegie's saying you have to pledge to spend about $1,200 a year to support the library after. Carnegie also wanted the libraries to be free. So I talked about subscription in private libraries. Carnegie didn't want to support those types of buildings. So he kind of wanted them to be free, public, and open to all. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little about kind of how we thought about the control group in this paper. So one thing to do, you might just say, let's just compare cities that got these libraries to cities that didn't apply for them at all. One issue is that cities that applied for these libraries we saw are systematically different from other cities, right? So instead of using those cities, right, and here's a comparison of cities that applied versus cities that didn't apply at all for the library. And so what this is that each of these dots and bars represents a regression, right, where the left-hand side variable is each indicated characteristic from the 1900 US Census, and the right-hand side is whether or not you built a library, conditional on state fixed effects. So you can see that cities that applied and actually built a library relative to other cities in their states, have higher earnings, have larger populations, have more craftsmen and operatives, right? People who might be engaged in creative activity. So it seems like this is unlikely to be a good control group. So instead, what we're going to do is use a new control group based on cities that applied, were approved, but ended up not building their Carnegie libraries. So there's an interesting set of reasons. The history of this is actually fascinating, why you would reject what in principle is a very good deal. Many of these cities ended up rejecting Carnegie because of his politics. So Carnegie was very unpopular nationally. Interestingly, he was kind of unpopular along a pretty broad swath of the American public. So he was unpopular among labor leaders because of some of his things that he was doing at his steel mills. He was also unpopular among some more, quote unquote, conservative kind of the Republican Party at the time, in part because he was a very strong isolationist. So he actually had he had friends because his money had bought him some friends, but he was actually unpopular among people all over the US. So here's an example of how this unpopularity started. So Carnegie I'm going to forget the year now, it's been a while, I think it was 1883, ended up breaking a strike at Homestead and ended up killing a significant number of people. He hired the Pinkerton militia to come in and break a strike. And this activity had impacts even years later as he started his library program. So here's an example, if I'm right, at least 15, I think even more years later after the Homestead riots, from Pittsburgh, Kansas. This is saying if Mr. Carnegie wants to be charitable, don't give us a library, right? Let him commence by supporting the widows and orphans of the people that he's murdered, right? So they ended up not getting a library, in part because of this argument. You know, so I can't claim that all the reasons, so in the end we have about 225 cities, I'll talk about them a little bit more, that make up our control group. You know, not all of them were due to Carnegie's politics. Some of them, the cities were unable, either legally or financially, to pledge this 10% support. And you might be worried that this is, you know, correlated with patenting in some way. So we're going to, you know, show results that exclude these cities in the paper. You could also think that, you know, it was hard to locate a place to build the library, right? And also in our baseline analysis, there's a small number of cities that actually said no to Carnegie because they said yes to someone else. And this would be actually an interesting third group to look at in our analysis, although I think there's 7 of them or something. So in the end, we don't use them in our baseline analysis, although we show that it's fine if we put them back in. Okay, so here is the geographic dispersion of cities that rejected Carnegie's grant. You know, remember that these are places that had applied, had made it all the way through the process, but in the end just decided not to take Carnegie's money. You can see that there's some nice geographic variation here. A lot of the analysis that we're going to do is going to focus on within state comparisons of the green and red dots. There are a few more in the South. In part, I didn't mention this, there could also be some racism that was driving some of the choices here. Carnegie changed his mind a few times in terms of whether or not you could segregate your libraries. And so cities in the South were obviously not thrilled with that, and they wanted to segregate. If we do the same comparison of city characteristics that I talked about before, things are significantly more balanced. So this is comparing cities that applied, were approved and built versus applied and ended up not built. Here are some pre-trends. So here I'm graphing the log number of patents +1 per city year on average in the years leading up to a library grant or rejection. So I think importantly, this paper is kind of interesting, especially if you've been following the recent literature on difference and difference designs. An interesting feature of this paper is that we're going to do everything kind of balanced off of a common date, right? So we know for all of our cities that both rejected and received a library, we know when they received the grant. We just know that some of them didn't follow up. So I'm showing the 20 years before the grants, and things look pretty good, both in trends and in levels, actually. So cities that received might be a little higher on average if you do the statistical test here, but things are looking pretty similar in the years leading up to a library grant. And the main result of the paper, if you take nothing away, I think you should take away this graph, right, is that in the years after the libraries were built, there does seem to be a divergence in patenting behavior between cities, the gray line, which is cities that actually built their library, and the black line, which is cities that didn't. That gap opens up. It doesn't open up right away. It kind of opens up in the 2 to 3 years after the grants are made. That's consistent with the timing of how long it took to build libraries. So remember that year 0 is when you receive the grant. This dashed line at year 3 is on average, how long did it take you to build a library. So we collected some new data on when all of these libraries actually opened to the public. So the timing is kind of consistent with this average. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I might go a little bit over if that's okay, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go quickly through this. I have not practiced a 40-minute length in a while. So the data comes from 2 library historians. Both the other thing in here that's not on the slide is that we also, at one point, we don't have it anymore, I had to return it, but at one point I had the microfilm of all the letters that went back and forth between cities that accepted and rejected Carnegie. So that was really interesting. And then we hand collected data on library openings. To get this interesting control group, this paper started actually when I was reading about the history of Carnegie Libraries, and I noticed that there was a chapter in this book that mentioned that there were these cities that ended up not building libraries. The chapter was called "The Libraries That Never Materialized," and I thought that was really interesting. Here's the bit about the correspondence. So, you know, to kind of figure out why Carnegie Libraries were not built, you know, we could actually look through the letters and kind of flag that information where it was available. Bobinski actually has some of this too, but we could compare our work. Data, we're going to use the NHGIS for some county characteristics, and then the decennial censuses to get city level characteristics. Paddots, so Enrico, this is how Enrico actually joined the project, because Enrico has, you know, maybe the best, I'm going to call it the best because I'm not him, so I can say it, you know, the best, you know, data set of, you know, rich information on Paddots that existed throughout history. It's called the Comprehensive Universe of U.S. Paddots. He's constructed it from all sorts of sources. Importantly for us, right, this is a city level treatment. So we wanted our analysis to be done at the city level, which is why Enrico's Paddots data was so crucial to this project. So we do a few things to select our sample. I'll just say these were imported at the time. We thought that these were all good selections to make, although in the paper I show that, you know, or we show that the results are very consistent towards relaxing any of these conditions. You know, interestingly, you know, one thing in this data is that you know, we do need a panel of cities that existed over this whole time period. So if a city was founded in 1901, we're not going to be able to match it to the 1900 census. So it's kind of important so we don't have a bunch of artificial zeros, right? Okay, so the empirical analysis is going to take a very straightforward difference in difference style approach, right? Especially in this first model. So just like a standard difference in difference, we're going to have an indicator for, you know, whether or not you were a city that received a library, whether or not we observe you after your library was built, right? Or after your grant was rejected. And then we're going to look at the indicators, right? Or the interaction between those two coefficients. Or the interaction between those two variables, sorry. And that means that beta 3 is going to be our core variable of interest, right? Yeah, so that is the paper. We're going to include city fixed effects. So actually in practice, this coefficient, right, is going to drop out. And then we'll show results with and without state year fixed effects, which kind of help control for some of the state specific trends in patterning that we do observe over this time period. So here are the primary results. You know, I don't want to spend too much time staring at these coefficients. This is where we get our 7 to 12% increase in patterning headline result. I will say that this is really just different ways of parameterizing that difference that we saw in the raw data, right? So in the graph that I showed you that had parallel trends and then divergence, that's just picking this up. And I should say this is using a sample that's 20, I think the slides are slightly, there's a slight typo. This is results that include 20 years before and 20 years after. So this is saying in the 20 years after a Carnegie grant was made in cities that accepted rather than rejected, we see about a 7 to a 12% increase in patterning. We can also do this dynamically, right, where we, instead of just letting a single coefficient try to summarize all of our results, we can let the results kind of go over time in a difference framework. And here again, we see something that's pretty consistent with that raw data that I showed you in the past, right? Which is here I'm excluding the 5 years before a grant was made as my control group, as my reference group. And here I'm just plotting the coefficients relative to that year across cities that accepted rather than rejected Carnegie. So here we can see that we have fairly flat trends in the years leading up to the libraries being built, and then we see this increase. Things start to decrease as we get further out. I think that's consistent with, especially, I'm just going to go back here for a second to this graph. You can see the same pattern here where the trends are moving pretty closely together, and then things are converging by the time we get out to about 30 years after the libraries are built. That's consistent, I think, both with our understanding of public libraries, right? So many of our control cities are actually getting libraries over this time period. So there should just be some natural attrition in the treatment effect for those reasons. And also the nature of innovation is changing, right? So if you think that libraries matter in 1900, and I do, by the time we get out to 1940, libraries, I think, are mattering a lot less, as innovation becomes more technical, right? Okay. Okay, so let me now that I've covered the main results of the paper, I'm going to go maybe a little bit more than 5 minutes, so we have plenty of time to hear from Jeff. I want to just highlight a few of the most interesting additional results and mechanisms that we find. These are all, of course, in the paper as well. So the first thing that I want to highlight is that we can do some interesting spillover analysis here. So our primary results are just comparing these cities that accepted rather than rejected Carnegie. Instead, what we can do is we can look at cities that are nearby to libraries. So this is kind of both a placebo test and also just an interesting exercise to think about, right? If you lived in a city, near a city that had a library, you could travel and use that library and pad it in your home city. There could also be this other effect, which is kind of a brain drain effect, right? You can imagine there's a library, maybe now people are moving to that city from nearby cities, so you might actually see a reduction in padding in nearby cities. So what we do is we basically draw these donuts, right, around each Carnegie Library city and cities that rejected the libraries. And instead of comparing the cities themselves, we compare the cities within this donut using the same framework as before. So when we do that, what we see is this pattern, right, where if we just look at our baseline estimate, right, this is the model with state year fixed effects, so it's about a 10% increase in padding. You see, if we look at cities that are within 15 miles, we see a smaller effect. And then if we include also cities that are within 30 or 45 miles, you see kind of a zero effect. So, this suggests that the spillovers are sort of very reasonable, I think, and that there's not some, it's not like the regions where Carnegie Libraries were built. It's not like the whole regions were just on a path towards being more productive, right? This does seem to be localized to the cities themselves. We've done some paddock quality stuff. Interestingly, this morning I was working on some additional paddock quality stuff. So I'll just say that when we use this various measures of paddock quality, including this claim-based method where we look at the word count of the first claim, and also when we look at the citations that these paddocks got in the long run, right? Like a very important paddock in 1910 can be cited many years later after citations are required. we see basically no effect on changes in average paddock quality. This suggests to us that this result isn't just being driven by low quality patenting. One thing you could think is that libraries aren't helping people come up with new ideas. What libraries do in part is help you patent the ideas you already have. And those might be lower quality on average. It's going to be hard for us to have the power to detect small changes in quality, but we're not seeing any large changes in patent quality in either direction after the libraries open. We do see an increase in women and immigrant patenting. So I'm not going to show those results just because I want to spend a little bit of time with the mechanisms. But I think it is important, right, that libraries are open to all. So they're open to new immigrants, and they're also open to women. And in fact, librarians are one of the few professionalized careers open to women at this time frame. So I think it is interesting that we see an increase in women and immigrant patenting, which is what those slides show.
Peter, sorry, you have just around 5 minutes, okay?
Okay, sounds good. So I'm going to skip some robustness. I'll just tell you that these all work. I think a very important thing that we do in this paper, and in fact I'm improving in the next version of the draft, is conditioning on time-varying city population. So Mike Andrews, for example, has a very nice paper on colleges showing colleges increased innovation, but it did so mainly through increased population growth. When we condition on time-varying population in this paper, we see that the effects go down a little, but they don't go away. So now I want to talk about the two mechanisms, right? So I think the first mechanism that we can think about is access to formal knowledge through books or through magazines, for example. So Scientific American, for example, during this time period is publishing lists of patents and imported patents, but also just all the patents, I believe. And all the libraries have subscriptions. So to test this, we actually look, we do two things. First, right, the first thing we do is we do some heterogeneity results. And what we find is that the effects of the libraries are largest in very practical trades, like performing operations and transport and mechanical engineering. We see kind of less effect in physics or in textiles or in chemistry, which you might think, especially chemistry and physics, require lab equipment. You can't learn about that in a library. The other thing that we do is we actually directly try to estimate whether patents are more likely to cite books. And we're actually, this is another thing that I'm refining currently, but to do this, we search the text of all the patents for words that are associated with book citations. So we basically made a training sample and kind of looked through and identified patents that are likely to cite books. Patents that cite books are rare, so this is the probability of observing a patent that cites a book. We only see that in 1.3%, or sorry, yeah, 1.3% of our city years in our sample. But we do see a pretty large increase, right, in the probability of citing a book relative to that low baseline probability. So this is kind of some direct evidence that these patents are more likely to be cited, or that these patents, are directly using information that you could get from a library. An interesting question is what books these are, and that's something that I'm working on now. The other thing that we can think about is not just formal knowledge, but also through collaborations. We also see an increase in the probability of observing multi-inventor patents. So multi-inventor patents are actually growing quite dramatically during this time frame. So if you think that libraries bring like-minded people together, there's clubs, there's all sorts of things. So we are seeing kind of a modest increase in the probability of observing, a patent that has more than one inventor. Great. So I will conclude. This was a very enjoyable presentation. It was nice to do it not in the context of the job market. So to conclude, I just want to highlight that we do think that libraries played an important role in promoting innovation, kind of during this golden age of American innovation. Libraries themselves, I think, are interesting, but really what this paper is about is it's about access to knowledge, right? So, Jeff, who's going to talk in a little, has a paper looking at patent depository libraries. Similar story there, right? When we reduce the costs of accessing past knowledge, what happens to innovation? If we think about the internet today, for example, the internet maybe had a similar effect. Other institutions that reduce the cost of accessing knowledge might have similar effects on innovation. So I think that's really the broader story about this paper. And I think that is it. I will end there. Thank you very much for being flexible with us.
Thanks a lot, Peter. I would say that you have done a great job considering that it was completely unexpected for you, this presentation. So now it's the time for the discussion. Please, Jeff, if you can share the screen with us. Peter, maybe you can unshare your screen.
Yes, hold on one second.
Jeff, you have about 10 minutes.
Okay, great. I'll try and be quick, although
thanks
I
a lot.
always think I'm going to be quick, and then who knows whether I actually turn out. Okay. So has the screen successfully shared?
Yes.
Yes.